completely turned off quite a bit. But, you know, 30 years later, the scene has changed. It's more relevant now. It just seems more readable.
Yeah. I think Professor Deep Singh is here. So,
okay.
Yeah. There is a chapter on linguistics as well in Thousand Plateaus.
Yes. And I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
What's more interesting about Deleuze is what he didn't engage with and why he didn't engage with it. But we can talk about that some other time.
Yes, later. Yes, he's here. Hanji.
Hanji, sorry, मेरे computer च कोई problem आ गई सी.
Fine.
Okay, so without any delay, I would like to invite Professor Mandair. And if you have any questions, you can ask right after Professor Mandair's talk. And then I'll start my presentation. And then we'll have discussion about that part later on. Okay. Hanji Professor.
Thank you, Ji. Vaji Khalsa Vaji Fateh. Sat Sri Akal ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ. Thank you for inviting me. Really honored to kind of be here for a second time. And really, actually, this is Prabh Sharandeep's space now, because I think he's presenting something quite new, which has been kind of behind the scenes. And this couldn't be a more timely occasion, I think, in light of events that are happening, to hear what he has to say, I think, both this week and the next week. So I'm going to make my remarks really, really truncated, really short, and they're really just setting a little bit of context to Harjot Oberoi's book. Harjot Oberoi, as you all know, is a professor at the University of British Columbia. He's been there since 1989. And as a personal anecdote, I was looking for places to study, do work in Sikh studies, and at the time I wanted to do Sikh theology, Sikh philosophy, and one of the first places I applied to was actually University of British Columbia, and in 1988, and I wrote a letter to Professor Oberoi saying, "What do you have to offer? Can you do a course, PhD by correspondence, because I have a job and I can't leave it." And he expressed a lot of interest and said, "No, I'm sorry, you'll have to look elsewhere. And the other thing, we don't do Sikh theology." I still have the letters, etc., etc. I had just finished with I'd actually applied to Punjab University Patiala to do a correspondence course there, but when I received the material, it was just a waste of time. So this is why I was looking around in other places, and I met Professor Harjot Oberoi for the first time in 1992 at Aston University. It was I think a Punjab research group meeting. And again, it was an interesting sort of time, and we didn't know much about the pending publication of Construction of Religious Boundaries at the time. But at the time, he was still very much an up-and-coming figure, and creating some interesting vibes in Sikh studies, in Punjab studies. Then the book came out, Construction of Religious Boundaries, Culture, Identity, Diversity in Sikh Tradition, came out in 1994. So it's almost 30 years since the book was published, or next year it will be 30 years. So it's a very fitting occasion that I think Prabh Sharan is doing this review of this book, a very detailed analysis of it in light of stuff that has happened in the past 30 years. And also in light of current events as well. The book was published by University of Chicago Press and simultaneously by Oxford University Press India. And it's interesting just looking at the background. Most people won't realize what kind of a time it was in academic studies of religion. The primary market of the book was the religion sector, the study of religion, particularly history of religions. But because it dealt with some theory as well, probably marginally, it was also designated within the theory of religion sector as well. The 1990s are an interesting time for those of us who can remember it as graduate students. The study of religion was undergoing a major change at that time. Post-colonial studies, post-colonial theory was picking up, and the two fields were converging in an interesting way. To some extent, this was a pushback against the current Marxist paradigms that were still in sway at the time. And some of the books that came out either before Oberoi's book or immediately afterwards are also interesting to note. So you can see the kind of convergence of interest in critiquing religion at that time. So Talal Asad's first major breakthrough book came out, Genealogies of Religion, which is a major event at the time, came out in late 1993. S.N. Balagangadhara's The Heathen and His Blindness, which was also a critique of the signifier religion, came out in 1994, the same time as Oberoi's book. A few years later, we see Russell McCutcheon's Manufacturing Religion. There was a book also by Jonathan Z. Smith that was plowing into the critique of religion. And in 1994, I believe, was also the year, or could have been 93, if I'm not mistaken, Edward Said's other major book on nationalism. And if anybody can remind me of the title, it'd be great. But I remember doing a seminar with Said at that time. So this was not just 1 year, but several years in which there was a major convergence of intellectual activity happening at the time. So in a sense, Harjot Oberoi hit the sweet spot when it came to the timing of the publication. It was a really interesting time. Another thing to remember was that people were really using in cultural studies, the shift from Marx to Foucault had happened in those years as well. So Foucault was becoming a major attraction if you wanted to kind of theorize power, resistance, and all of these things. So he brought in terms like genealogy and other resistive terms as well. Which also feed back into Harjot Oberoi's book. Religion departments were going through a major hiring phase in the mid to early 90s. It was a time of expansion. So these kind of diversity hires, not in the way that we understand diversity today, but I think the diversification of the subject area of religion was happening in a very major way. So people who studied India, South Asian religions, etc., Chinese religions were increasingly hired as well at that time. So I'm just trying to set the scene for what was actually happening. In Sikh studies, those of us again who can remember at the time, Punjab politically had just come out of the phase of militancy, was still in the kind of throes of trauma at that time. The Indian economy was liberalizing, and Sikh studies itself was in a kind of a very difficult phase, I think. There were polemics happening against Sikh studies scholars, and it was a difficult terrain to actually kind of be on. And I won't sort of go into that very much, but I will indulge myself if Professor Randeep would not mind me indulging a little bit, and again, another personal anecdote. I was working on, just starting to work on my dissertation in 1994, and that's also when I met Professor Bogle at the University of London, SOAS, and I think there were 3 of us working with Professor Shackle, and it was seen as the kind of the growth of Sikh studies at SOAS. It was myself, Professor Bogle, and Dr. Jeevan Deol, who we all started at the same time. I was working on a dissertation in philosophy, thinking between cultures, and was trying to figure out how to understand the influence of British colonialism on the Sikh mindset. And that's one of the things that Harjot Oberoi's book kind of helped me to do with his chapter on the interpretive process. And that's one of the things that actually attracted me to the book in the first place. And in the midst of the controversies, I decided to actually write a review article on the book, which came out in 1995. The article was called Interpreting the Interpretive Process. And it came out in the International Journal of Punjab Studies. There was also a major workshop event around not just that book, but I think similar things that were happening at the time at the University of Oxford. Again, it was organized by the Punjab Research Group at the time. There was a lot of buzz, basically, about this book. So I gave a very critical, but at the same time appreciative overview. The article itself went into detail looking at the what I think is the central theoretical aspect of Harjot Oberoi's book, which is to look at the epistemic shift that he talks about from the so-called pluralistic cultures that were in place prior to British colonialism to the more closed, textualized cultures. And part of what he's arguing is that colonialism exacerbated the kind of a tension that was already there. And he paints a picture in the early parts of his book where he talks about the enchanted universe of a very pluralistic, almost idyllic kind of society that existed in Punjab and in other parts of North India. And that colonialism closed all of this and created a more kind of textualized culture in conjunction, much more in conjunction with Judeo-Christian paradigms and norms, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I did in the article was to actually critique the way that was being depicted in Oberoi's book. And I found that there was a problem between the so-called labeling of these, what he called Sanatan cultures as under the framework of orality, where orality was basically a kind of a more diverse, hybridic kind of framework. You know, this was a melange of cultures. There was fluidity, etc., and that closed everything off after colonialism and created more kind of elitist societies. And in a sense, Harjot Oberoi looked at the transition of the Amritsar Singh Sabha to the Lahore Singh Sabha precisely in those kind of terms as well. This framing of the entire work between oral Sanatan cultures and textual colonial cultures, if you like, and the Lahore Singh Sabha being the example of that. And one of the things I did was to call this into question, and that I believe that he did not really understand the power implications of using the terms orality and textuality in the way that he did, but primarily because there was a deep misunderstanding of what we understand as Sanatan culture. or the term Sanatanta and Sanatan Dharma itself, which he put forward as the kind of exemplary aspect of pre-colonial culture, the one that kind of got sort of closed off. And so rather than seeing it for what it really was, which was Sanatanta was actually the foundation of Brahmanical orthodoxy, he presents it in this kind of really fluid sort of sense. And this is something I took up in more detail in Religion and the Spectre of the West in chapter 5, and where I called that oral culture simply the Vedic economy, basically, because you cannot understand those any culture in which Sanatanta had been pervasive without understanding Vedic culture as well, and the predominance of the Vedic paradigm within, particularly within North Indian culture, but probably all of Indian culture, for over 2 millennia, and the way that it has structured power relationships, social relationships, etc., etc. So there is a huge issue with all of this, and this is where I think Prabhu Sharan's work will lay the foundations for a new way of kind of thinking on this, and I think a lot of effort is kind of needed. And one thing I ought to say just before I finish, I think what Sanatan culture and this kind of Vedic economy was alluding to is a fundamental ontology, a way of understanding being that has been the ordering factor within what we understand as North Indian society. And because it's the ordering factor, it is also the factor that brings power into the equation, but often remains invisible. And it's that invisibility, I think, which has given rise to much misunderstanding. And this is why we need to kind of delve more deeply into some of the themes that are prevalent in Harjot Oberoi's book. And without that, I'm gonna call it a day there and let Prabhu Sharan himself take the stage. So thank you for giving me a few minutes just to lay the context, and I look forward to listening to what you've got to say. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. So before I begin, are there any questions about Professor Mander's ideas? Okay. Okay, then I will begin my presentation now. And after that, we'll have a discussion session. You can ask questions or you can share your questions in the chat box. So as Professor Mander mentioned before, in 1994, Harjot Oberoi published The Construction of Religious Boundaries. The monograph was based on Oberoi's PhD that he started in 1987. Before he started his PhD, he had written an MPhil dissertation on Bhai Veer Singh. And in the preface to The Construction of Religious Boundaries, this is how Professor Oberoi described his motivation behind the research. Quote, this book seeks to answer two closely related questions. How are Indian religions to be conceptualized? What did it mean to be a Sikh in the 19th century? I first began to grapple with the latter question in 1978 when I wrote a master's seminar paper on Sikhs and the Singh Sabha movement for the Center of Historical Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Having seen how the modern Sikh intelligentsia at the turn of the century sought to answer the key questions of this study, I went on to review the writings of one of these intellectuals, Veer Singh, for an MPhil dissertation. And he further explains his project. As is often the case with historical inquiry, I ended up with far more questions than I had answers for. Why did an influential set of Sikh leaders seek to purge established practices and established a homogeneous religious community? Why was religious plurality looked at with disdain? What was the role of the Raj, the British colonialism, in all this? Answering these questions required a much longer journey than I had bargained for. It took the shape, first of, a doctoral dissertation at the Australian National University, Canberra, and then later on he had feedback from Mark Jurgensmeyer, Jerry Barrier, and Robin Jeffrey, and according to him, that transformed his work. Um, and he said, as a result, this book does not closely resemble the dissertation, particularly in its overall argument and specific discussions. So these are the basic questions. So the first question is, how are Indian religions to be conceptualized? Professor O'Brien has assumed something called Indian religions as a general category. The religions in the South Asian subcontinent do not fit in any general category. One category is the Brahminical tradition that includes Vedic, Vedantic, and Pranic and Yogic and many other traditions. Another is Islam and the Sufi movements associated with Islam, and then Sikhi that offered critique of both the Hindu traditions and the Islamic and Sufi traditions. So before we begin, we need to have a clear idea what was going on before 19th century. And the second question was, what did it mean to be a Sikh in the 19th century? And O'Brien explains this question, having seen how the modern Sikh intelligentsia at the turn of the century sought to answer the key questions of this study, he started MPhil on Bhai Veer Singh. So who were the people who started the Singh Sabha movement? Who was Gyani Dutt Singh? Who were the others? What was their background? Where did they come from? Why did they decide to identify as Sikhs? And why did they decide to critique the Hindu ideas of religion, which at that time were kind of reinvented, revived, or reformed under several movements, Arya Samaj being the most relevant one in context of this discussion. So who was Gyani Dutt Singh? Gyani Dutt Singh was born in a Sikh family, and that family belonged to a caste group that Brahminical establishment has declared as untouchable. The name of the caste group is Ravidasya. The previous name that Brahmins had assigned to the caste group was Jamyar. So the untouchables, according to the Brahmins, they, because of their birth, did not qualify to learn Sanskrit language, to learn Hindu Shastras, to have any kind of education. Caste groups were assigned duties, dharma, the Hindu idea of religion is a righteousness in the sense that one needs to prove that one is righteous by doing the duties assigned to that person. And how were the duties assigned to those people? The duties were assigned based on the karma. Karma is the deeds, good or bad deeds, people had done during their previous incarnations, during their previous life cycles. So, based on the karma, they were born either, according to Brahmins, the upper caste, or in some lower caste, or somewhere in between. So, the way Brahmanism defined everything, individuals were responsible for their birth in particular family belonging to specific caste group. Since they were responsible, therefore, they were supposed to do the duties that were assigned to them in the Dharma Sutras and do nothing else. So, what did the Dharma Sutras define? Dharma Sutras, prominent among them is Manav Dharma Sutra, and Manav Dharma Sutra is also known as Manu Smriti. Dharma Sutras provide a definition of the Hindu idea of dharma, and the definition is based on the oldest, the most ancient Hindu scripture, Rig Veda. In the 10th mandal of Rig Veda, there is a section called Purush Sukat. And Purush Sukat describes human existence in this way. Out of Brahma's head, Brahmins were born, out of chest, Kshatriyas, out of waist, Vaishyas, out of feet, Shudras. Therefore, Brahmins would be the intellectuals, the head, the brain. Kshatriyas would be warriors, kings. Vaishyas would be traders. And Shudras would be doing the jobs. They would be engaging in the occupations that were considered ugly, filthy, or despicable by the upper caste communities. And those jobs included cleaning people's households, cleaning their waste from their toilets, doing agriculture, and dealing with leather. So the Ravidasya community that Brahmins named as Chamayar community or Chamar, because they deal with cham means leather. It was one of those working class communities that were condemned to a particular occupation. So that there was no powerful resistance against that, those prohibitions upon the human potential. So when I say human potential, it has fundamentally two aspects. One is spiritual, another is temporal. In spiritual context, the question is, can any human born in any caste have ultimate spiritual salvation? In the temporal context, the question is, can any individual born in any caste group have the ability to do the occupation, to choose the occupation of his personal choice? For example, can a Dalit, who was condemned to be an untouchable, be an intellectual? a king, a trader, or anything that he or she wants to desire? The answer was no. The jobs were permanently assigned. Sanskrit, the Hindu scriptures were written in the Sanskrit language. And Sanskrit, according to Brahmins, was the divine language. And the divine language, only those belonging to the upper caste communities, they had the right to learn and read and then teach Sanskrit, which was supposed to be the divine language. So the people condemned to be the lower caste people did not have any agency. They did not have access to the knowledge. So if we look at this from the Foucauldian context, Foucault's critique of power, it is that power is not, according to Foucault, that belongs to some center. It's not limited to some center. Power is power in the form of knowledge is dispersed in human life in general, inside people's subjectivities, their own individualities. So power operates through people. And the Brahminical power is probably the best example of the Foucauldian critique of power. Because what I just described, which was the definition of the Hindu idea of dharma, that is just the theoretical framework. The Hindu traditions has a lot more in them, which is there is a huge number of gods and goddesses, and gods and goddesses are local. They're local deities, and people are connected to the local deities for generations. And the local deities not only define the communities that follow them, their sense of spirituality, sense of religiosity, or the metaphysical framework for them to see in the world that they inhabit in the first place. They perform as agents that connect people, that keep people connected to the Vedic and Vedantic metaphysics. That is the philosophical foundation of the idea of dharma, which is more like a code, social code, which is more like laws. Manu Smriti is also translated as the laws of Manu. So this code that was minutely defined, including the punishments. For example, if a person who Brahmins considered to be an untouchable tries to listen to the divine word, then molten lead would be poured into their ears, and if they try to recite, then their tongues would be nailed. These kind of punishments. So Brahmins controlled the power in the literal sense as well, because they were the guides for the kings who were Kshatriyas, and Kshatriyas had the political authority, they had the military. So if any of the members of the communities who were declared as untouchables by the Brahmins tried to violate the Brahminical code, the Brahminical laws, Then they had the law enforcement machinery to punish them as well. And one of the most well-known examples is Shambhuk, the story of Rishi Shambhuk in Ramayana, a Dalit who had spiritual inclinations, and he took the path of his individual spiritual cultivation. And Ramchandra, the Hindu god, found out about it. He went there and he spoke to Shambhuk, and he told him that was a violation that he wasn't supposed to do. Therefore, he would be punished. And Ramchandra took his sword out and he killed the rishi, the sage Shambhuk, Dalit sage Shambhuk, right there. So, what does it say? How do we understand what was happening to the human beings, to the human life in general, because of the Brahmanical hegemonic control? First, they had permanently prohibited for so-called lower caste individuals to explore either their spiritual or their temporal potentials. There was oppression. And secondly, this control mechanism, dharma was a control mechanism. This was denying any dignity to the communities who were condemned to be the lower caste communities. That is one side. We will talk about the Sikh response to this first, then I'll bring in Islam, and then we'll get back to the 19th century context when Singh Sabha started, the past. So when Guru Nanak Sahib came, Guru Nanak Sahib said something that no religious figure had said before. That was, नीचा अंदर नीचात, नीची हूं अत नीच, नानक तिनकै संग साथ, वड्डियां स्यों क्या रीस, जिथै नीच समालियन, तिथै नदर तेरी बख्शीस. Now, this shabd does not say, does not just advocate for the human rights of the Dalits or for the equal rights. It proposes a fundamental shift. The shift is how to locate oneself. The one who is on the spiritual or religious path, how to define one's connectedness with the human society in the first place. And Guru Nanak Sahib said, I am one of the lower caste people. And I am even lower than them. Nicha andar neejat, nichi hoon at neech. I am extremely lower. Next line. Nanak tinka sang saath, vaddiyan syon kya rees. That is even more radical. While being in their company, I do not even compare it to the so-called upper class society. What are they as compared to these people? Next line, more revealing. Jitthai neech samaliyan, tithai nadar teri baksis. Wherever these lower caste people are, that is where your blessing, O Akal Purkh, is. So what does that mean? according to Brahmins, Rigved was Shruti. Shruti means the text, the speech that was heard by the sages who had some special spiritual capabilities, some particular spiritual height that they were in position to listen to the divine word. So Rigved, according to Brahmins, was the revealed divine word that did not belong to this temporal Mayavi illusory word. That is the foundation of the authority. Now, Guru Nanak Sahib is saying, declaring that divinity does not lie with the so-called upper caste, upper class people. Divinity lies with these people. So when Guru Nanak Sahib is associating with the Dalit communities, Guru Nanak Sahib is not doing something like a nice upper caste person would do as a charity. It's not a charity work. It's identifying the potential and identifying the extra potential, because Sikhi says, Kaal khaye, kish hathon de, Nanak ra pachane se. Those who work hard and earn their livelihood, and then they share that with the others, they identify the path. So there is a specific focus on the work, on the labor, and on the working class. Therefore, Guru Nanak Sahib identified the divinity at the site where the Brahmins had exactly denied that divinity. Then there's a history of the Guru Sahiban, and then peasants. You know what peasants used to be called in America? In America, peasants were denigrated as sod busters. Sod is ground, land, and the one who bust is. And that is exactly the Brahminical critique of the peasants, that they are sod busters. They plow and cultivate the fields according to Manu Smriti. And in the process, when they plow or cultivate the fields, they kill many insects and they kill vegetation. And that is something unholy. Although the Brahmins gladly eat the grains, the foods produced by the peasants, everybody does, but they had this critique that this was despicable work because it involved Jeev Hatya, killing many, many creatures. So we see the upliftment of the peasant communities with the advent of Sikhi, and we see other Sikhs belonging to many other caste groups. And just to mention about the Punjabi Khatris, sometimes people confuse the word Khatri with the second Varna Kshatriya. Punjabi Khatris, according to Brahminical caste system, are not Kshatriyas. They are Vaishyas. They are the trader communities that in the Brahminical system has been classified not as Kshatriyas, but the Vaishyas. So the third caste group, Khatris, is not necessary actually among the so-called upper caste groups. Upper caste are basically Brahmins and Kshatriyas. So the Vaishyas and the Shudra and the untouchable Dalit communities, when they all joined Sikhi, the transform was they had the opportunity to explore the their human potential and engage in the occupations that they prefer to engage in, and second, to 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 explore their spiritual potential at the same time. That is one aspect. Now, Gyani Dit Singh, in the late 19th century, he belonged to a caste group that was untouchable caste group according to Brahmins. But his father was a scholar and he was well versed in Nyaya and Shastra. And because of his father's scholarly background, his father sent him to some Udasi scholars in Ambala, where he got his initial education. And from Udasi scholars, he went to the Dera of Gulab Das, and then he got his rest of his intellectual orientation from the Udasi Dera of Gulab Das. So, as a Gulab Dasi scholar, Gyani Dit Singh became a preacher, and he started going to different villages, started giving sermons. That was his occupation, his routine life. So, what does it tell us about the Sikhs in the 19th century? It was perfectly fine for a Sikh with Dalit background to have religious education, to learn Sanskrit, and it was perfectly fine for that trained Sikh scholar to work as a preacher. So when it comes to the matter of whether or not a specific individual deserves to have education, then it's more about the religious institutional setup. That shows us that the Udasi institutional networks who were connected to Sikhi, but who were also under the strong influence of Brahmanism at the same time, they were not having the caste-based Brahminical discrimination against the individuals coming from the Dalit communities. That is another aspect. Second aspect is the community. If the community had the anti-Dalit hatred or anti-Dalit sentiments based on their Brahminical orientation, then nobody would invite Dittaram, the first name of Gyani Dit Singh was Ram Ditta, then he became Dittaram, to give religious discourses. But he was accepted as an Udasi religious preacher. So caste was, I'm not saying there's absolutely no caste system among the Sikhs, but there's difference. There was space for Dittaram to learn Sanskrit, to learn Farsi, to have religious education, to become a preacher, and to work as a preacher. Then in 1873, Singh Sabha movement started. In 1875, Arya Samaj movement was founded in Maharashtra. And soon after, the founder of Arya Samaj movement, Swami Dayanand, came to Punjab, was in Punjab for about a year. And while he was in Punjab, Gyani Det Singh met him, and there were 3 debates between Gyani Det Singh and Sadhu Dayanand. And later on, Gyani Det Singh wrote those debates down and published in form of a tract titled Mera Ate Sadhu Dayanand Da Samvad. Mine and Sadhu Dayanand's dialogue. And in that writing, there's a mix of prose and poetry. And he has like a exceptionally good sense of humor as well. And I want to read this couplet, this dora, from 2 doras from this book, Mera Te Sadhu Dayanand Da Samvad. ਜਿਵੇਂ ਭੜੋਲਾ ਚੌਧਰੀ ਉੱਜੜ ਖੇੜੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਿਉਂ ਵਿਦਿਆ ਤੇ ਹੀਨ ਨਰ ਲਏ ਸੁਆਮੀ ਖਿੱਚ ਵਾਏ ਵਾਏ ਸਭ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਅਰ ਕਰਕੇ ਵਿਸ਼ਵਾਸ ਆਖਣ ਉਤਰੇ ਵੇਦ ਸਨ ਚਾਰੇ ਰਿਖੀਆਂ ਪਾਸ. Now, you know what ਭੜੋਲਾ is? ਭੜੋਲਾ is silo to store the grains in. So in old days, people used to leave their villages, and if the land was not good enough to cultivate, if they didn't get enough rain in that area for several reasons, and then they used to take up everything and move to another place and set up another village. And padolas in those villages would be left behind. Kheda means village. So that is ਜਿਵੇਂ ਪੜੋਲਾ ਚੌਧਰੀ ਉੱਜੜ ਖੇੜੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਿਉਂ ਵਿਦਿਆ ਤੇ ਹੀਨ ਨਰ ਲਏ ਸੁਆਮੀ ਖਿੱਚ. As the padola is the lord in an abandoned village, that is how the Swami Dayanand, attracted individuals who had no education. And this dora makes an important point. This is an important insight that I want to talk about. Vidya is education. Education is what was not available. It was something prohibited for the communities that Gyani Det Singh belonged to. Now Gyani Det Singh is saying, ਤਿਉਂ ਵਿਦਿਆ ਤੇ ਹੀਨ ਨਰ ਲਏ ਸੁਆਮੀ ਖਿੱਚ. The people, individuals, nar is man. So men with no education, the Swami has attracted the men with no education. That is what it's saying. So Gyani Det Singh's claim is, or assertion is, education is essential. Education is essential to understand the fraud behind the claims of divinity that define Brahmanism in the first place. So his motive is to educate people, so they are not attracted to a deceptive preacher like Swami Dayanand. That is in the first place. Secondly, Gyani Dit Singh had his own background, his own spirituality, his own sense of belonging with a certain praxis that was Sikh praxis. So, coming back to Harjot Oberai's question, why? Why these people did not like plurality? Why these? Let me read that question one more time. Why did an influential set of Sikh leaders seek to purge established practices and establish a homogeneous religious community? Why was religious plurality looked at with disdain? Now, for Gyani Dat Singh, it was a revival of the old control mechanism. It was an attempt, the Hindu reform movement were engaged in an attempt to re-establish the hegemonic control of the Brahminical establishment on the entire society once again. So it wasn't the plurality. It was Brahminical forces encroaching upon the psychic space of the communities that Gyani Dit Singh came from. That was what was going on. The third question, that's an important question Professor Oberoi has raised. What was the role of the Raj in all this? That's an important question. And I will address this and then connect this to the rest of the discussion. The Raj in form of East India Company had its foothold during the second half of the 18th century. After the East India Company was victorious in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, then Battle of Buxar in 1764, and then Bengal became part of the East India Company's British governance. And then they kept extending their empire. And during the late 18th century, they came in contact with the Hindu elites, most of whom were Brahmins, who were big landlords who owned thousands of acres of farmland and who were scholars at the same time as well. By 1805, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, a Hindu aristocrat whose family was known as the family of the kings. His name was Ram Mohan Rai, but they were known as Rajas because they were big landlords. He wrote a tract titled The Gifts of Monotheism. In 1809, by 1809, because of the rise of the Sikh power in Punjab and rise of Maratha power in Maharashtra, and several other reasons, Mughal Empire was declining, and 1809, the priestly class of the Hindus, they saw it as an opportunity, and thousands of Hindus followed hundreds of priests in the city of Benares, and they declared to demolish a mosque that, according to them, was built at the site of an old Hindu temple, Lord Bhairav. And then there were riots. Then 1815, Ram Mohan Rai founded Atmiya Sabha. 1828, Ram Mohan Rai founded Brahmo Sabha. 1830s, early 30s, Brahmo Sabha becomes Brahmo Samaj. And then the crucial point to answer the question that Professor O'Brien has raised, which is, what was the role of the Raj in all this? In 1830s, two other sabhas emerged. One was Zimidari Sabha, Landlords Association. Another was,
I don't know what's the best way, but if we should keep this step in here just to have like an easier way to getting down.
Bring it down, yeah.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be too hard, bro, because
who is this?
you've already made it pretty low to the ground, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's a good thing you backed it like
Can we
this.
mute? Who's this?
We can drag it a little bit more.
Uh-huh.
I think it's Fateh Singh.
Okay, he's muted. Okay.
He's muted. Okay. 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 So Zimidari Sabha and British India Association. The Raj, by founding the first British Indian Association, initiated a process to train the Hindu elites for engaging in the Western style modern political activity, which involved making modern style organizations with bylaws, with governing bodies, with meetings that would keep minutes. So the Raj had been training the Hindu elite for at least 4 decades when Singh Sabha movement was founded in Punjab. And that process of training continued all over the South Asian subcontinent until a British A.O. Hume founded a political party known as Indian National Congress in 1885. Indian National Congress was formed as a party that represented several Indian associations all over the subcontinent. Something else the Raj was doing specifically in context of Punjab. When the British colonized Punjab in 1849, thousands of Hindus from several South Asian provinces came with the British as second level administrators in Punjab, because Hindus who had experience in administration, they knew Urdu and they could understand Punjabi. Punjabi people could understand their languages, and it was convenient for the British to govern Punjab with a second level administrators who were from the vicinity of Punjab, who were not the locals, but and those administrators They were the immediate colonial elite that the colonized Sikhs in Punjab had to deal with in the first place. Secondly, they were interested in advancing the Hindu revivalist movement as well. For example, Lahore Brahmo Samaj was founded in Lahore in 1862, 11 years before Singh Sabha movement, by Babu Nabeen Chandra Roy, who was a civil servant and administrator working for the British colonial administration. And there are other examples of coordination between the colonial administration and the Hindu elites. On the other hand, the Raj wasn't very supportive to the Sikhs. If Professor O'Brien is asking the question, what was the Raj doing in all this? In context of what was the Raj doing for the Sikhs or about the Sikhs? The first thing Raj did, it demolished the well-established indigenous school system that Maharaja Ranjit Singh had established in the Sikh kingdom. 1851, the British introduced the first new school in Punjab, and by 1855, they planned a new education policy. Immediately after colonization, the Raj declared Urdu to be the official language, and they started to have school curriculum textbooks prepared for school curriculum in Urdu language. The process was led by two Muslim elites, civil servants working for the British, Altaf Hussain Hali and Muhammad Hussain Azad. So on the one hand, there are Hindu colonial administrators. On the other hand, there are Hindu leaders of Hindu revivalist or Hindu reformist movements. Then there's a coordination between the Hindu colonial elite and the leaders of Hindu revivalist movements. And then there's a Hindi language, recently invented Hindi language that came along the Hindu elite. On the one hand, there is a Punjabi community that is in support of the advancing of the Hindi language in Punjab. On the other hand, there's a Punjabi Muslim community that was in support of advancing Urdu language in Punjab. And in this Hindi-Urdu controversy, the supporters of Hindi and Urdu languages, they declared Punjabi to be a vulgar language that wasn't developed. I would like to cite an example. When Tagore was awarded the Nobel Prize, and when he returned after getting the award, some journalists asked him a question. Why do you think you have received the award and not Dr. Iqbal? And Tagore said, perhaps because I write in my own language and he doesn't. Iqbal was a Punjabi. He was from a Punjabi community in the southern part of Kashmir, now in the Pakistan side, known as Azad Kashmir. And then they had correspondence with each other. Tagore wrote to Iqbal and asked him, why don't you write in your own language? Iqbal said, because Punjabi is not a developed language. Tagore did not know much about Punjabi language. He kind of believed Iqbal, but he said, how would the language develop if you don't write in it? I write in my own language, and by writing we contribute in developing our language. But I mean, I do not question Tagore's intentions here. He was being very genuine, but he was unaware of how far Punjabi language had progressed until 12th century. In 12th century, Baba Sheikh Farid wrote his Bani in Punjabi language, 12th and 13th century. And then, starting with 15th century, we have Bani of Guru Nanak Sahib, other Guru Sahiban. Then there's Bhai Gurdas. Then many other poets, Bhai Gurdas II, Bhai Nandlal, and then there's a huge history of Punjabi literature. There are like Sufi poets, Shah Hussain, Bulle Shah. There are Qissa poets, Damodar, Waris Shah, many. And ironically, most of the poets, Sufi and Qissa poets, who wrote in Punjabi language and who are considered to be not great Punjabi poets. They are considered to be among the poets, among the greatest poets in the entire human history who wrote anywhere in any language. Like, I mean, everybody has personal favorites. People like Waris Shah, good poet. But better than Waris Shah, we have Hashim Shah, Mian Muhammad Baksh, Maulvi Ghulam Rasool, and Khwaja Ghulam Farid. So Iqbal was a Muslim. How could Iqbal, who was such a strong supporter of the Muslim community, the Islamic concerns of the Muslim community, how could he call Baba Farid's language, the language of Baba Farid's Bani, as a language that's not developed? Harjot Obrai asked question, what was Raj doing all this? Dalhousie wrote letters in which he described what the Raj wanted to do. Completely decimate the Sikhs. And attack on Punjabi, the colonial attack on Punjabi language is part of that larger strategy. And the unfortunate part is, in 1870s, when Singh Sabha scholars led by Professor Gurmukh Singh, Gyani Det Singh, they tried to have Punjabi included in the school curriculum, they had to face strong opposition from Hindu and Muslim Punjabis. Despite all that, Punjabi was included in school curriculum of Punjab University Lahore in 1879, but that's a different story. I want to go back to our previous context. Who were these Singh Sabha people? As I mentioned before, Punjabi Khatris were not Kshatriya. They are the Vaishya, according to Brahmins. They are the trader communities. So who were these people? These were working class people. These were people condemned to be the lower caste people by the Brahmins for the centuries. Sikhi created a space, not just a discursive space, a socio-political space where these people could realize their temporal and spiritual potentials, where these people could enjoy having sense of dignity that every human being deserves to have. For the first time in probably thousands of years of their history in that subcontinent. But some people might argue Gyani Dit Singh had some connection with some coordination with the Arya Samaj as well. And Arya Samaj was against caste system as well. And that is an important point. If caste, if revival of the dignity that these communities had lost because of the Brahminical caste system had been the only concern they had, then Arya Samaj was also against caste system. But obviously, that wasn't the only concern they have. They had some other religious and spiritual affinities that they had developed with Sikhi throughout their history. That's one aspect. I'll leave it here and I'll go to the other aspect, which is Islam and Sufism and Qissa tradition in Punjab, or influence of Islam and Sufism, Sufi traditions on the culture of Punjab, and its relevance in context of our discussion about the religious boundaries in the late 19th and early 20th century Punjab. So let's go back to Sufism. I will try to be as brief as possible, but I need to give you somewhat clear idea of what was it about. So I would share in beginning some details about the origin of Sufism. It begins with Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Arabi was concerned about the future of Islam after invasion of the Greek philosophy in the Islamic world. And Islam is first and foremost defined with Shariat. I'm not saying Islam is limited to the Shariat or the Islamic code of conduct, but that is what first and foremost defines the religion of Islam, defines the Islamic code of conduct. So Ibn Arabi tried to develop a philosophical argument in favor of Islamic Shariat. So the motivations behind the origin of the Sufi movements is to keep Islam relevant, to keep the religion of Islam relevant in the transformed philosophical context. And Ibn Arabi certainly was not just a scholar or a philosopher, he was a mystic as well. And his writings include his mystical experiences as well. And his mystical experiences are functional in shaping his philosophical insights or his philosophical outlook as well. Throughout the Sufi tradition, the Sufi peers, they have both concerns. One is to cultivate their spiritual self, to advance on the path of Islamic or Sufi mysticism, to progress on that. And they are very genuine about it. They are very authentic and they're very sincere about it. There's nothing I would want to critique. I have a lot of respect for the Sufi mystical traditions and the amazing literary works and philosophical works they have produced. Like, it's hard to count. Maulana Rumi and Punjabi Sufis, Baba Farid, Bulle Shah, Waris Shah, Shah Hussain, huge list. So, what do Punjabi Sufis say about it? Let's hear from Bulle Shah. ਸ਼ਰੀਅਤ ਸਾਡੀ ਮਾਈ ਹੈ, ਤਰੀਕਤ ਸਾਡੀ ਦਾਈ ਹੈ, ਅੱਗੋਂ ਹੱਕ ਹਕੀਕਤ ਆਈ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਮਾਰਫ ਤੋਂ ਕੁਝ ਪਾਇਆ ਹੈ. Shariat, the Islamic law, is our mother. Tariqat is the nurse that gives birth. Aggo haq hakikat aayi hai, then hakikat has come. And then we have achieved something from marfat. So Shariat includes laws of Quran, the Islamic code of conduct. Tariqat includes believing and remembering Allah. Hakikat reveals the hidden meanings of Quran. And Marfat reveals and identifies us, the Muslims, with the hidden identity of Allah, His heaven, and His Spirit's moments. Bulle Shah, who is known about saying Pathan namazan te chikkad roze, is saying this. So my understanding is when Bulle Shah is critiquing, he is critiquing the institutional decline in the Islamic world. He's not critiquing the religion of Islam. He's a mystic. As a mystic, he explores several languages. He speaks several languages. Several languages, Vedantic idiom, Sikh idiom, they influenced Bulle Shah. He speaks those languages. And those languages, the traces of those languages in the writings of Sai Bulle Shah can be used to characterize Bulle Shah's text as hybrid. And I have nothing against hybridity. I like to explore the idea of hybridity even further. But the representation of hybridity, as we find in the works of Bulle Shah, is meaningful in the sense that it broadens our understanding and experience of hybridity beyond what Homi Baba wrote about it, the way Homi Baba tried to make it relevant. And I have a quote from Homi Bhabha's Location of Culture. I will read that quote and then connect it to our discussion about hybridity in Punjabi literature, Bulle Shah in particular. So let's hear what Professor Bhabha has to say about hybridity. This is from Location of Culture, page 114. Quote, hybridity reverses the formal process of disavowal so that the violent dislocation of the act of colonization becomes the conditionality of colonial discourse. The presence of colonialist authority is no longer immediately visible. Its discriminatory identifications no longer have their authoritative reference to this culture's cannibalism or that people's perfidy. As an articulation of displacement and dislocation, it is now possible to identify the cultural as a disposal of power in negative transparency that comes to be agonistically constructed on the boundary between frame of reference / frame of mind. It is crucial to remember that the colonial construction of the cultural, the site of the civilizing mission, through the process of disavowal is authoritative to the extent to which it is structured around the ambivalence of splitting denial repetition, strategies of defense that mobilize culture as an open textured warlike strategy whose aim is rather a continued agony than a total disappearance of the pre-existing culture. Let me read it again. Whose aim is rather a continued agony than a total disappearance of the pre-existing culture. Okay, let me decode it a little bit and then we'll move on to Bulle Shah and the question of hybridity. So what is Professor Bhabha saying here? Professor Bhabha is saying in the process of colonization, transformation is not a one-way process. Transformation is happening on the both sides. Colonizers are being transformed as well. They are not only the transforming agency, they are being transformed as well. The agony of the colonized is effective among the colonizers. That is. Now, let's get back to Bulle Shah. Who was Bulle Shah? Bulle Shah was a Muslim. What kind of Muslim Bulle Shah was? He was a Sayyid. Sayyids are upper caste Muslims. Not all, but many of the Sayyids are the Muslims, are those whose ancestors were Hindu Brahmins. So Brahmins, when they converted to Islam, they became Sayyids. But that does not mean all the Sayyids are with Brahminical background. There might be other criteria, light skin, some other criteria, because Bulle Shah's family was from Uzbekistan, and Bulle Shah was a 5th generation child of migrants from Uzbekistan. But he identified as a Sayyid. His murshid, his master, was Pir Anayat Shah, who was Arai. Arai among the Muslims are considered to be lower caste. And Bulle Shah did not want to identify with his Sayyid upper caste, but he wanted to identify more with his Murshid Pir Anayat Shah. That is the reason Bulle Shah wrote, Jeda Sanu Sayyid Akhe, those ki miln sazayan, Jeda Sanu Rai Akhe, Bashte Pinga Paya. The one who calls us Sayyid should be punished in the hell. The one who calls me Rai should be enjoying the swings in the heaven. So Bulle Shah was a Sufi mystic who was a Muslim. And Muslims were the ruling class. And upper caste Muslims were the families who were closer to the ruling elite, or who were actually the families of the Muslim aristocrats, feudal lords. So who is Bulle Shah? Bulle Shah belonged to a community that was closely associated with the Islamic power. Islamic power had colonized the South Asian subcontinent just a few centuries ago. It was Lodhis before the Mughals. First, the Lodhis were contemporaries of Guru Nanak, and then Babur came, and then it became the Mughal Empire. Now, why do I mention Islamic power, Mughal rule, in context of our discussion about traces of hybridity in the writings of Saint Bulle Shah? Islam, or the Islamic world, ruled several parts of Asia, went inside Europe, became victorious, converted Mongols, and built large empires, not simply because they had armies, they knew strategies of war, they knew how to perform in the battlefield. These were not the mere reasons. These are never the reasons. The fundamental reason was, by the time Islamic world started to expand its political power, Islamic civilization had progressed in many directions. And Sufi mystics, who were also philosophers, they were one aspect of exceptionally developed Islamic civilization. So Islamic rulers, many Islamic rulers, not all, are known for converting people, non-Muslims, into Islam by force. Aurangzeb and many others are among them. But scholars in the field of history or study of religion in South Asia, they are well aware of the fact that the large-scale conversions did not take place as a result of the forced conversions by Islamic rulers. They happened because of the popularity of the Sufi mystics. Now the question is, why were Sufi mystics popular? First reason, they were genuine mystics. Second, they were scholars. And the word for scholar used to be in the Islamic world. The word was Hakim. Hakim was a word that would be used alternatively for a scholar, for a scientist, for a physician. So most of the Islamic theologians who were trained as in an Islamic seminary as a theologians, they were physicians as well. They knew how to treat people's illnesses. So the Sufi dargahs, they were the medical centers and they were the spiritual centers. That's two aspects. Third aspect is people always had psychological issues. People always had mental illnesses, traumas, anxieties. But people always did not have the present day like advanced psychotherapy. So they were not able to identify or diagnose their anxieties, traumas, or mental illnesses caused by anxieties or traumas. Sufi peers used to offer treatment for those mental illnesses. And their way was, and that way was not limited to the Sufis, but it was in the Sufi dargahs as well, that people who acted abnormally, they were possessed by the spirits, some evil spirits. So when they acted abnormally, they were not the actual actors. Their body was a site through which some evil spirit was acting out. So they would use several devices, which included beating of the person and giving them heat shocks, like putting hot iron rods on their body and addressing the spirit to go away. So that torture was a psychological device that delivered message to the patient to somehow avoid acknowledging the traumatic voices that were coming out of his when anxiety or trauma overpowered his psyche and those. So these kinds of treatments. So people, they were popular among people. Harjot Obrai identified people were going there. And in the beginning of this account of the Sufi dargahs, I said Islamic world was able to expand its empire because Islamic civilization was well developed. And the works on human psyche, on nafs, how to address nafs, how to control it, that Sufi philosophers have produced, they are amazing works, profound works, even if we read today. So Sufis made themselves relevant among the local communities because of several of their capabilities, which included first and foremost their genuine commitment to the path of Islamic mysticism. That is. So Sufi movements were agencies that were bringing the locals in the fold of Islam. If the locals converted to Islam, it was much more convenient for the rulers to rule over them. Second, they wouldn't have some other religious tradition as a rallying point that would provide them platform to organize in a strong resistance against the Islamic power. That was another aspect. But the fundamental reason behind the desire for conversion is rooted in the very defining of the Islamic empire. For example, Dr. J.S. Garewal, in his History of South Asia, the history of the Sikhs that is published in the Cambridge series, has noted down that the Lodi kings identified themselves as Naib to Khalifa. Naib is the second in command. Khalifa is the leader of the Islamic world. Muslim king identifying himself as subordinate to Khalifa is declaring that this rule is not a secular rule. It's an Islamic state. It's Islamic rule. And Islamic rule, to be successful, needed several agencies to connect to locals. For example, if I ask a simple question, I over and over again acknowledge Sufis were mystics, very genuine. But at the Sufi dargahs, people were asked to read Kalma and convert to Islam. And that was a common practice. So Sufi mysticism or Sufi spirituality did not see any contradiction in having a strong connection with the religion of Islam. So Sufi mystics did not find it problematic to convert non-Muslims into Islam. Asking people to read Kalma and convert to Islam was a common practice on Sufi dargahs. So who was Bulle Shah? Bulle Shah belonged to a mystical movement that was extending, that was significantly contributing in expanding of the Islamic empire faster in the discursive sphere than in the temporal space. So Bulle Shah, who belonged to power, who worked to expand the discourse of power, his poetry is hybrid. We can find traces of Islam and we can find traces of Vedant and Sikhism in Bulle Shah's writing. Let me read some. Karm shara de dharm batavan sangal pavan peri. Jaat mazhab e ishq na puchda ishq shara da veri. ਨਦੀਆਂ ਪਾਰ ਮੁਲਕ ਸਜਣ ਦਾ ਲਹਵੋ ਲਹਾਬ ਲਾਭ ਨੇ ਘੇਰੀ, ਸਤਗੁਰ ਬੇੜੀ ਫੜੀ ਖਲੋਤੀ ਤੈਂ ਕਿਉਂ ਲਾਈ ਆ ਦੇਰੀ। ਪ੍ਰੀਤਮ ਪਾਸ ਤੇ ਟੋਲਣਾ ਕਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਭੁੱਲ ਗਿਓ ਸਿਖਰ ਦੁਪਹਿਰੀ, ਬੁੱਲੇ ਸ਼ਾਹ ਸ਼ਾਹ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਸੂ ਦਿਲ ਨੂੰ ਦੇ ਦਲੇਰੀ, ਆ ਮਿਲ ਯਾਰ ਸਾਰ ਲੈ ਮੇਰੀ, ਮੇਰੀ ਜਾਨ ਦੁੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਘੇਰੀ। ਸੋ ਬੁੱਲੇ ਸ਼ਾਹ who is saying ਸ਼ਰੀਅਤ ਸਾਡੀ ਮਾਈ ਹੈ, ਤਰੀਕਤ ਸਾਡੀ ਦਾਈ ਹੈ, ਅੱਗੋਂ ਹੱਕ ਹਕੀਕਤ ਆਈ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਮਾਰਫਤੋਂ ਸੁਖ ਪਾਇਆ ਹੈ। He is critiquing Shara at the same time. How do we understand this contradiction? This contradiction is part of the fundamental outlook of Bulle Shah, the Sufi mystic. Shariat is the Mai, Shariat is the beginning, Shariat is the foundation, but the technicalities of Shariat cannot be allowed as hindrances when he pursues his mystical path. That is the context. One more reference from Bulle Shah. 1 second. We are almost out of time. Forgive me for being taking so long, but we'll take some questions if you don't mind, if you can stay longer. ਚਲੋ ਦੇਖੀਏ ਉਸ ਮਸਤਾਨੜੇ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹਦੀ ਤ੍ਰਿੰਜਣਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਈਏ ਧੁੰਮ, ਉਹ ਤੇ 100 ਵਹਿਰਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਰੰਗਦਾ ਏ, ਨਹੀਂ ਪੁੱਛਦਾ ਜਾਤ ਦੇ ਕੀ ਹੋ ਤੁਮ। ਜਿਹਦਾ ਸ਼ੋਰ ਚਫੇਰੇ ਪੈਂਦਾ ਏ, ਉਹ ਕੋਲ ਤੇਰੇ ਨਿਤ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ, ਨਾਲੇ ਨਾਹਨ ਅਕਰਬ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ, ਨਾਲੇ ਆਖੇ ਵਫੀ ਅਨਫਸਕੁਮ। ਜਿਹਦਾ ਸ਼ੋਰ ਚਫੇਰੇ ਪੈਂਦਾ ਏ, ਉਹ ਕੋਲ ਤੇਰੇ ਨਿਤ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ, ਉਹ ਨਾਹਨ ਅਕਰਬ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ, ਨਾਲੇ ਆਖੇ ਵਫੀ ਅਨਫਸਕੁਮ। Now there are two Quranic references in this line. Nahan akrab ilai min hablil varid. I am in your jugular vein. ਰੱਬ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਸ਼ਾਹ ਰਗ ਦੇ ਕੋਲੇ ਹੈ, ਸ਼ਾਹ ਰਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈ। ਜਿਹਦਾ ਸ਼ੋਰ ਚਫੇਰੇ ਪੈਂਦਾ ਏ, ਉਹ ਕੋਲ ਤੇਰੇ ਨਿਤ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ, ਨਾਲੇ ਨਾਹਨ ਅਕਰਬ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ, ਨਾਲੇ ਆਖੇ ਵਫੀ ਅਨਫਸਕੁਮ। ਵਫੀ ਅਨਫਸਕੁਮ ਅਫਾਲਾ ਤੁਬਸੀਰੁਨ, ਇਹਦਾ ਮਤਲਬ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਕੁਰਾਨ ਚੋਂ ਆ, ਆਇਤ 21, and in yourselves then will you not see. Okay, so two issues. One is God is in your jugular vein right here, and that is something you will not see. So that couplet from Bulle Shah is a response to those people who say Islam is fundamentally dualistic. And when Bulle Shah is talking about non-duality, he is actually being Vedantic. I'm again saying there can be found Vedantic traces in Bulle Shah, but this is directly from Quran. He cites words from a Quranic ayat as it is. Let me read next couplet. ਛੱਡ ਝੂਠ ਭਰਮ ਦੀ ਬਸਤੀ ਨੂੰ, ਕਰ ਇਸ਼ਕ ਦੀ ਕਾਇਮ ਮਸਤੀ ਨੂੰ, ਗਏ ਪਹੁੰਚ ਸਜਨ ਦੀ ਹਸਤੀ ਨੂੰ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਸੁਮ ਬੁਕਮ Sumum bukmun umyun fahun layarjun. Deaf, dumb, and blind, so they will not return. ਛੱਡ ਝੂਠ ਭਰਮ ਦੀ ਬਸਤੀ ਨੂੰ, ਕਰ ਇਸ਼ਕ ਦੀ ਕਾਇਮ ਮਸਤੀ ਨੂੰ, ਗਏ ਪੌਂਡ ਸਜਣ ਦੀ ਹਸਤੀ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਸੁਮ ਬਕਮ the one who have turned deaf, dumb and blind, they have merged their existence with the beloved, with Allah, and that is non-dualistic, and that is directly from Quran. One more, ਨਾ ਤੇਰਾ ਏ ਨਾ ਮੇਰਾ ਏ ਜਗ ਫਾਨੀ ਝਗੜਾ ਝੇੜਾ ਏ ਬਿਨਾ ਮੁਰਸ਼ਦ ਰਹਿਬਰ ਕਿਹੜਾ ਏ ਪੜ ਫਾਜ਼ ਰੂਨੀ ਅਜ਼ਕੁਰਕਮ ਫਾਜ਼ ਕਰੂਨੀ ਅਜ਼ਕੁਰਕਮ ਵਸ਼ਕਰੂਲੀ ਵਲ ਤਕਫੁਰਨ remember me and I shall remember you. Be thankful to me and do not be ungrateful to me. ਨਾ ਤੇਰਾ ਏ ਨਾ ਮੇਰਾ ਏ ਜਗ ਫਾਨੀ ਝਗੜਾ ਝੇੜਾ ਏ ਬਿਨਾ ਮੁਰਸ਼ਦ ਰਹਿਬਰ ਕਿਹੜਾ ਏ it's neither yours nor mine. This world, the idea of ownership of this world is a futile conflict. Bin murshid rahbar keda hai? Who is the guide without the master? Parfazruni azkurkum. Read fazkuruni azkurkum vashkuruli wala takfurun. Read what? Remember me and I shall remember you, Allah says. Or the Prophet says, be thankful to me and do not be ungrateful to me. So Bulle Shah, a Sufi mystic, is first and foremost a Muslim. Islam and Quran are primary sources of Bulle Shah's Sufi mysticism. Now we find traces of, we read the word Satgur, that's Sikh language. We find other traces. We found Ranja Yogi. He's calling Prophet Muhammad Ranja Yogi. Ranja was a lover from Punjabi love story here, Ranja. Ranja was a Punjabi folk hero who appeared in many kissas, many long poems written about his love story. Yogi is the yogi belong to the Hindu yogic tradition. Ranja became a yogi to be able to reach the house of Heer's in-laws and get her out of here there and be in union with his beloved. So Bulle Shah is calling Prophet Muhammad Ranja Yogi. Some people say that's Advait. That's local traditions. But the sections of Bulle, some couplets from Bulle Shah's Kafis that we just read, Bulle Shah was first and foremost an Islamic mystic. So the traces of hybridity that we find in Bulle Shah, they are immaterial. And I am going to share one last thought and say one or two sentences about next week's second part of this lecture. And I'll finish right here within 2 minutes. And if you, then after I finish, Professor Pogel will say a few words and initiate the discussion. And after Professor Pogel finishes with his remarks, we'll be open for the question answers. And if you have time, then I would prefer to stay as long as the questions continue to appear for a while, I mean. So Guru Gobind Singh initiated Khalsa in 1699. Guru Gobind Singh reached Nanded in 1707. Guru Gobind Singh's Jyoti Jyot Samauna in 1708. Babinda Singh Bahadur came to Punjab in 1710. became victorious in several battles, established Sikh kingdom, was arrested 1716, martyred, long cycle of genocide against the Sikhs between 1716 and late 1720s. Sikhs reorganizing, more genocidal violence in the hands of both Afghan invaders and the Mughal rulers. The Sikhs continued to resist. A community that continued to resist for at least 7-8 decades. Even after facing multiple cycles of genocide, they must have a shared sense of identity. They must have well-defined religious boundaries. Otherwise, the Khalsa that was leading the Sikh resistance in the jungles surrounding different areas of Punjab, they would have been isolated. Khalsa needed everything: human resources, horses, food, clothes. They were dependent upon the Sikh community living in the villages and towns that was not directly participating, actively participating in the Sikh resistance, but without their ongoing support, this 7-8 decades long resistance against the Mughals and the Afghan invaders wouldn't have continued in the first place. But this resistance was successful. What was that sense of community? How do we understand that sense of community in the 18th century? What is the definition of that community, that idea of community, idea of religion in Sri Guru Granth Sahib? What does Bhai Gurdas say both about the idea of Sikhi as a religion and the religious boundaries of the Sikhs? The difference between the Sikhs and the Hindus in particular. That is early 17th century text. What does it say about the religious boundaries? And how do we connect to the 18th century literature, to Sri Guru Granth Sahib, and historical developments, to the initial Sikh textual sources? And what is their connection with the Singh Sabha? How do we contextualize Singh Sabha? I mean, there is Islam, there is Hinduism in 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. There are conflicts in those centuries. And there are conflicts in the 19th century. How are those conflicts connected to those? I wanted to read a poem by Gyani Det Singh, Pama Prabodh. Next week, we're going to begin there. We're going to have a detailed discussion about Professor Obrai's idea of Sanatan Sikhism, and we'll have certain sections from the construction of religious boundaries that will cite, and we'll have detailed discussion about those sections, and the other context, and we'll have textual analysis of the writings produced during Singh Sabha period and the connection of those writings with the Sikh historical unconscious as well as the Sikh memory. So these are the areas and themes to explore in our lecture next week on Professor Harjot Obrai's The Construction of Religious Boundaries, next Saturday, 11 a.m. Pacific time. We'll meet again. Now, I will request Professor Pogel to share his remarks, insights, questions, whatever he would prefer. And after Professor Pogel finishes with his remarks, will be open for questions from all of you. And thank you so much for your patience and for joining us and for being with us for such a long time. Professor Saab.
Thank you, Professor Andeep. That was an amazing foundation to build upon in terms of the issues that are at play with the first publication 30 years ago of Hazrat Oberой's Construction of Religious Boundaries. I have 3 or 4 points to make, some sort of reflections to elaborate and deepen and support what you have already laid the foundation for. I think you are to be congratulated for the depth of your analysis in terms of both the Islamic world and the Brahmanic, Hindu, Vedic world.
Someone sent a message that your audio is a bit low. Can you?
Okay, let me see if I can speak nearer to the mic. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. So one of the things that this book by Professor Oberoi details is shared deeply and clearly with Professor Mandir's book on the spectre, Religion and the Spectre of the West. Both of them bring to fore the notion of religion making. And they both talk about the transition from a pre-modern to a modern culture. Now that transition in Oberoi's understanding is overly romanticized from Mandir's understanding. So in Oberoi's understanding, we get the shift from a Sanatan culture to a Tatkalsa culture, and that this transition, as Professor Mandir and Professor Andeep Singh has already pointed out, is too simplistically charted from an oral culture to a written culture, from a pluriversal, a plural culture, a diverse culture to a culture of uniformity, from a natural to an unnatural, from a primal to iconoclastic, from a popular to elitist, from pre-modern to modern. So Oberoi argues that this transition is sort of negative. We lose an enchanted, diverse world of popular saints and practices and heterogeneity and hybridity, and we enter into the straitjacket and stiffness of a uniform, homogeneous culture that is instigated by print technology, textuality, from orality to textuality. Now, both Professor Mandir and Professor Andeep Singh has already outlined how that is an overly romanticized shift. Professor Oberoi employs the term, Foucault's term, episteme, that there's a plural episteme shifting to a homogeneous episteme, an oral episteme shifting to a textual one. So I applaud Professor Andeep for detailing how this is deeply problematic, and that we need to look at not just colonial culture and the religion making that comes from British Christian Protestant nomenclature, but also the internal cultures. And I think this is where I gained the most from Prabhshandeep's talk just now, is the detailing of the internal colonization or the internal hegemonic forces of both Islam through the Sufis, dargahs, and practices and poetry and literature, and also the Vedic economy and Brahmanical culture. I think that there's a wonderful, fruitful ground there, that even though the Sufi cultures have great uplifting, inspiring poetry, it is tied to a commitment to what I would like to call as a discriminatory universalism. Now, this is a really important term, I think, and I wrote about it recently. So if you have the patience to listen to a little bit more, I'll just read out what I wrote about this discriminatory universalism, which helps both a Brahmanic worldview, Islamic Sufi worldview, but also a British worldview, Christian worldview. So reviewing, sorry to read to you, reviewing Dipesh Chakrabarty's 2002 Provincializing Europe, Amit Chowdhury writes, if, quote, modernity has already had its authentic incarnation in Europe, how then can it happen again elsewhere? End of quote. Leaving the non-West in the limbo of Chakrabarty's potent image of the imaginary waiting room of history. Here employed is a view of history and modernity that has, according to Chakrabarty, at once liberated, defined, and shackled us in its discriminatory universalism. So I'm lifting the term from Amit Chowdhury, whose analysis of Chakrabarty's book employs this term, discriminatory universalism. My emphasis on Chowdhury's phrase ponders how a universalism can be particular and so discriminatory. If it were universal, how can it be applicable to some and not others? This flaw in colonial logic has been duly analyzed by much post-colonial critique into various pernicious hierarchical binaries, starting with the civilized barbaric fiction all the way to Darwin's favored races, and perhaps most powerful vector of European discriminatory universalism, the general notion of religion. Remember the work that's been done since Oberoi's book, and one of the key ones is Tomoko Masazawa, which relates plurality, which Oberoi uses as a symbol of enchantment and hybridity and a world that we've lost, mourning that world. So plurality is a very positive thing. We're shifting from that to a more homogeneous culture. But the word plurality, just like the word liberalism, is tied to the discriminatory universalism, is tied to a negative reading. So Tomoko Masazawa's subtitle to her book, The Invention of World Religions, is Or How European Universalism Was Preserved in the Language of Pluralism. So pluralism comes to the aid of a discrimination. And I think Prabhshandeep's talk today established that very well, into, despite the plurality that we see and the hybridity that we see either in scholars, Homi Bhabha, or within actual literature, whether it be Bulleh Shah or others, or they preserve a certain discrimination through an assumed universal. Let me carry on a little bit. But this discrimination manifested differently across Europe. Kapil Raj notes a split in two imperial colonial powers as they form the West and its epistemological modernity. Now here's quite an interesting contrast here that Kapil Raj brings to fore. He talks about French universalism and British globalism. In contradistinction to liberté, égalité, and fraternité, British globalism held fast to the irrevocable importance of property and inequality for a properly civil society. Edmund Burke in 1790 claimed equality to be unnatural, as well as impractical, being unrealizable as a goal. Quote, You think you are combating prejudice, but you are at war with nature. In the eyes, in his eyes, Burke's eyes, the natural order of things was clearly based on inequality and hierarchy. Hence, the elitist colonial education of the Badrulok employed and resonates it, employed the resonances it had with Brahmanical caste and class divisions to forge, quote, an alliance between British and Hindu elites in order to confine and finally vanquish the French and their ideology of their notion of universal. Richard Wellesley, 1760-1842, the Governor General of the Indian Territories of East India Company in 1797, argued to the East India Company's Court of Directors in London that at a college, Fort William, needed to be set up to counter the French ideology, arguing, quote, to fix and establish sound and correct principles of religion and government in their minds at an early period of life in the best security which can be provided for the stability of the British power in India. Wellesley aimed to inculcate in the future writers of the company the necessity of stable social structure, precisely, quote, to counter pernicious Gallic egalitarian ideas. Raj continues, it is interesting again to compare this idea of stable hierarchical social structures to Burke's description of Hindu society, and parallels he draws between the Brahmins and the English nobility, jointly imagined as Aryas. Not only representing Hinduism as a very old monotheistic religion, but also naturalizing its hierarchical social structures as civilized and fortunate. So there's an alliance here on the very subject matter in which Oberoi romanticizes plurality, but misses the complicity plurality has with the discourse of imperial powers and internal powers, whether it be Islamic imperialism or the rising power of Hindutva and Hindu-concentrated identity politics. So I think that's really important that the British promoted the Brahmins because they shared a certain notion of a discriminatory universalism. What was different with the Sikhs? They had a notion of universal that de-linked from this discrimination. And I think that's a very powerful thing that came through Prabhu Deep's talk in terms of the resistances that we see with Gyani Dit Singh in terms of his critique of others and the Singh Sabhas as being a part of that movement in which a new modernity was being sought. There wasn't just one model of modernity. Many people around the globe have had ideas, I would argue, in advance of European modernity and European man. And the Sikhs, I think, are an example par excellence of that new modernity that got suppressed. So whilst there is an importance to understand the force of a discriminatory universalism that comes from the outside through colonial modernity of Protestant Christianity, there is also equally important work that Prabhu Deep Singh is doing to show the internal mechanics of another form of discriminatory universalism that occurs within Islam and Sufi traditions and the Vedic economy, because both of them have a hierarchy which resonates with an imperial hegemonic power. But the Sikhs have a different view. And I think the resistance that they had was directly tied to the liberation of the lower castes, the peasants, so-called peasants, human beings that have finally got agency. And this is what empowers them. A new vision of human being was being invented beyond European notion of being. I think that's all I really wanted to say. I want to just applaud the session and to bring out this clear critique. And we mustn't just completely fold our own traditions and forget the power that they have by mimicking, whether it's a Sanatan worldview that is sort of in vogue now with certain Sikhs, that they want to gain some kind of acceptance in somebody else's worldview, as though we're Hindus. We shouldn't fold our own treasure as though the only highest treasures have been found either by Islam or Hinduism or Protestant Christianity in the form of secular British rule. Why are we selling ourselves so short so quickly? And what's the myopia, the short-sightedness of these individuals makes me ponder whether they know the genuine treasures within the Sikh tradition itself. I'll end my quiz.
Thank you so much, Professor Pogal. That is so kind of you. And your input is very insightful. It also helps us to explore this area further. So thank you so much for sparing so much time and sharing your thoughts. I noticed we have Professor Iftikhar Malik from Oxford with us. And when I was at Oxford, I was a member of Wolfson College, and I had the pleasure to frequently see Professor Malik and have the company of a profound scholar. That is something exceptionally good about Oxford, that in form of colleges, it provides us with small communities where we frequently, sometimes on daily basis, get together for lunch and dinner in the college dining hall, in the college cafe. And it's so kind of Professor Iftikhar Malik to
Professor Malik has sent a question in the chat.
1 second.
But
I saw that.
Yeah.
I am requesting Professor Malik to come and share his thoughts and question with us. It would be nice to see you again, Professor Malik. Please. Yeah, so nice of you. So good to see you.
Sat Sri Akal. Ki haal
Sat Sri
hai?
Akal ji, Sat Sri Akal.
So nice to see you. And when I got the email, I said I should mark my presence and I say hello to everybody. And it has been a wonderful presentation. And you have so much of knowledge, not only about Sikhi, but about Hinduism and about Islam and about Sufism. And I was enjoying your presentation and how you know Arabic and Urdu and Altaf Hussain Ali and Maulana Muhammad Hussain Azad, and how we were defining these identities, or how these identities are defined under the hegemony of the Raj, and how we became sort of parallel communities. So what I was wondering, we do miss you in Oxford. It's very quiet at the moment because students are gone. And I'm still very much here. Last year I was in Punjab. I spent a whole year teaching in Lahore, my old college, government college, and it has lots of students with special needs. And Lahore is the heart of Punjab, whether we live abroad or we live in India or in Pakistan. And I also, went to Kartar Sahib, and I really enjoyed meeting people from India, from Canada, from Britain, and a small community of Sikhs from Pakistan. And we had students, Sikh students from FC College Lahore. And I felt so good that, this little place, sacred place, Baba Guru Nanak's place, in Kartarpur, has brought us together despite all the political things. So that's the spirit behind my question. The question is that you talked about hybridity, that all these communities come together, languages, culture, mostly they're peasants, and then there are some ruling elite, and you mentioned Bulleh Shah and Sayyids and all that, and Brahmin. But I'm also worried that in any plural setup, because of political reasons or because every religion wants to, claim its own space, that sometimes hybridity is overtaken by politics, by hegemony. And these communities, and they become very conflictive. And maybe that is where in 1947, all the four communities, sadly, we talk about Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, and we forget Christians. All the four communities and a small community of Parsis, Zoroastrians in Punjab, I mean, we became perpetrators as well as victims. I'm not saying all the Punjabis, but my worry is that commonalities could bring in hybridity, but they could also bring conflict. So I wanted to know, your view about how come. I mean, we could blame the Raj, we could blame whatever, Urdu language, Hindi language, external influences, but I think hybridity is not taken for granted. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your time and for everybody's patience here.
First of all, it's so nice you spare time and so nice to actually see you. I didn't want to read the question and respond to it. I wanted to hear from you. So nice to connect with you again. Second is two issues here. One is shared space. Another is religious boundaries. My understanding is in Punjab, shared space didn't have conflict with acknowledging the boundaries. I say Sufi mysticism is Islamic mysticism. I like Bulle Shah because he is a mystic. And he is an Islamic mystic. That's the beauty of it. He brings a spiritual height, civilizational greatness of an amazing religious tradition in the language that both I and Bulle Shah belong to. I'm avoiding to try to say my language because it's not just my language, but I can say it's my language. In our language, Bulle Shah wrote poetry that we are proud of, that we enjoy, and Bulle Shah shared mystical experiences that are meaningful to us, Muslims and non-Muslims. Now, my issue is I do not want anybody to try to convert Bulle Shah to either Sikhi or to Vedant. Appreciate Bulle Shah for what it is. I am against the interpretive processes that deny the difference, that whitewash the identities. About shared space, it's not even a matter of discussion. We have to have a shared space. We had a shared space in Oxford. It was like, how can Punjabis not talk to each other? How can't we have a shared community? If we cannot, then it would be a loss. It would be a great cultural loss. 1947 has been a great cultural loss for everybody involved. So I acknowledge Bulle Shah and I respect Bulle Shah. And that process was initiated by Guru Nanak Sahib. Baba Farid ji clearly wrote, Frida be Nawaja Kuttya, e na pali reet. Kab hi chalna aaya panje waqt maseet. And Guru Nanak Sahib is including that Bani in Sri Guru Granth Sahib. Guru Nanak Sahib or Guru Arjan Sahib did not decide to exclude that couplet. It is in it. And that is the greatness of it. That slok cannot be excluded. I am saying it must not be excluded. We respect Baba Farid's Bani. ਸਾਰੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਮੱਥਾ ਟੇਕਦੇ ਆ ਜਦੋਂ ਗੁਰੂ ਗ੍ਰੰਥ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਦੀ ਬਾਣੀ ਨੂੰ ਮੱਥਾ ਟੇਕਦੇ ਆ ਸਿੱਖ ਬਾਬਾ ਫਰੀਦ ਦੀ ਬਾਣੀ ਨੂੰ ਮੱਥਾ ਟੇਕਦੇ ਆ ਬਾਬਾ ਫਰੀਦ ਦੀ ਬਾਣੀ ਗੁਰੂ ਰੂਪ ਹੈ ਸੋ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲ what Harjot Oberoi is saying, Harjot Oberoi is failing to acknowledge the human concerns beyond the limits of Marxism, beyond the material conditions. Human life is not totally about material conditions. It has a lot more. It's about senses of belonging, about exploration of their individual creativities, about their shared spiritualities, about their shared spiritualities across the religious boundaries. Why do I like Bulleh Shah? Because Bulleh Shah's Islamic mysticism, as a human being with spiritual inclinations, I relate to it. I totally relate to Baba Farid's Bani. And I never thought about converting to Islam. And I never thought about converting any Muslim, let alone Bulleh Shah, to Sikhi. It's like shared cultural space cannot be an excuse for encroaching your neighbor's personal space. And unfortunately, we have witnessed that in history. But we need to keep working. We need to keep working. Punjab, for centuries, have been singing people like Bulleh Shah. Punjab had lost Shah Hussain. Dr. Mohan Singh Diwana collected copies of Shah Hussain and published. And now Shah Hussain is everywhere. Shah Hussain wasn't something that we would have lost. We should have lost. It should have been kept alive. And Shah Hussain is well and alive and an important figure. So it's like, it's a Professor Puran Singh, the poet and scholar. He was the first among the South Asians to openly write about contradictions. He said, contradictions are the beauty. Now scholars trace contradictions to question the very existence of some specific tradition. Uniformity cannot be the way to go. Contradictions has to be there. Cultural contradictions, cultural differences, they are all right. They're fine. Punjabis in a shared space used to have respect, and Sikh Kingdom is a good example. No state-sponsored genocide and no religious conversions. That is, religion has to be individual's personal choice. It has to be that way. And individuals together, they form communities. Then it becomes community's personal space. So shared space has to be based on the respect of each other's personal boundaries. That's all. Otherwise, I agree with everything you said. I completely admire the sentiment that we have to have that space, that we, unfortunately, have lost and are losing every day. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Looks like we do not have any other questions. And once again, I appreciate everyone who joined us for such a long session. Special thanks to Professor Iftikhar Malik, Professor Balwinder Singh Pogal, Professor Arvind Pal Singh Mandir. We are well aware of how busy professors are, and professors are busier than most people in other occupations, and we respect that very much. It's so nice to see all of you, and we'll end this session right here. Next week we'll meet again. We'll begin with two questions: the question of hybridity, the question of culture and imperialism, and then we'll connect culture and imperialism to colonial administration, to the previous rules, and then to the relevant literature from Punjab. And I hope to see you all once again next week. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.